Hello, my name is Jonathan Cox, and this presentation is developed and created for my CGS class. And today we'll be talking about software development and distribution as intellectual property. In my abstract in the paper, I mentioned how in a technologically rich age, software permeates every aspect of our modern society. From the code that comprises the software that controls airplane flight patterns to snippets of code posted on popular help websites such as Stack Overflow, it could become very difficult to differentiate which innovative code should be protected by intellectual property protections and which shouldn't. When I say which shouldn't, I usually mean by the fact that some code, even though it's innovative, it's also customizable. And by restricting the level of redistributability or a level of customization, we can hinder other innovators from actually improving on that code. And we'll talk about that later. I also mentioned how the concept of intellectual property protection was designed to protect the creators of some of today's most innovative products and inventions, and actually, it wasn't a new development. Intellectual property protection goes all the way back to medieval ages, which we'll go into later. And going back to software development today, when these code innovations can be easily copied and pasted, the line drawn between easily distributable code and copyright protected software can often be blurred. And in this aspect, we'll see how it can be determined if intellectual property protection helps or hinders software development, especially in an industry where the latest coding practices can become obsolete overnight. And the first section that I touched on in the paper is how is software affected by intellectual property protections? Well, when you think about it, in the 21st century and even the 20th century, from the dawn of the internet, technology has constantly been improving. The website of 1980s is definitely not the website of today. When we talk about innovations made by Facebook, made by Microsoft, made by industry leaders such as Hawaii, Cisco, or otherwise, many of their innovations are constantly changed, constantly protected so as to stop other companies from pretty much cashing in or exploiting on these innovations, on these steps towards complex levels of code. And what was once an innovation yesterday can also be a novelty or obsolete product today. Fast forward today, and it can be seen that these protections have played their roles in allowing some of the basic innovations of the day to grow. Imagine if there was no intellectual property protection. Many of the creators and inventors of those software or those software products or those hardware products would not be motivated to anticipate or take on a field which they weren't familiar with. But today, they have cashed on that, and we benefited as a society today. When it comes to software in general, however, these intellectual property protections could potentially hinder growth, especially in customizations or implementations, like I mentioned before. As I go through the paper that I uploaded to Moodle, I talk about three sections. The first section is introduction, to touch on intellectual property that we just went over. The second section discusses what intellectual property laws have done throughout history up to today, and they also go into how software and industry and technological innovations, where they first began being protected by intellectual property laws and when they developed and improved due to new reaches or actually branches in economy. When I say that, I kind of allude to the fact that software, in essence, technology, has changed our economy permanently. In the third section, we weigh the costs and benefits of having intellectual property rights and how such laws are maintainable across borders. And the fourth section will just pretty much cover everything that we've gone over, including analyze what the best approach would be to encourage intellectual incentives when maintaining and protecting intellectual property rights so as to facilitate further economic and technological advances. Now, to begin understanding intellectual property protection, we have to understand its history. When we look at the history of software patents and actually industry patents, we have to go back all the way to the earliest instances. And some of the earliest instances go all the way back to medieval Europe. Collections of artisans and engineers who specialized in their own variety of trades formed guilds, and the reason they did so was to establish a government-backed level of control that allowed them to determine what could be marketed, imported, and produced, and by whom. Very similar to how today's economy works and how today's innovators work. Intellectual property centers did little more, however, than to create a chokehold on intellectual innovation back then, because their main focus was, in fact, restricting the amount of innovation and limiting the Protestant Reformation movement at the time and control the spreading of ideas and radical beliefs throughout the printing history. And the example that I used in the paper is the Stationers' Company, which was created in 1556. And as you can see, even at the very beginnings, intellectual property protection can have its different motives, how interest groups can infiltrate laws, and how innovation in the end can be restricted. And that's one way how intellectual property laws can be a hindrance to innovation. Fast forward to the modern era, and we're seeing businesses such as Taco Cabana and 2 Pesos making lawsuits regarding multi-millions of dollars just due to the decor of their franchise locations. Even though this example has very little to do with software, it just gives us a glimpse of how software can get out of hand. And when it comes to intellectual property protections, many things are up for grabs. Code isn't unique. It's just a bunch of algorithms or processes that make an end product. So when an innovation is made in code, or when a product is created, especially if it's easily distributable, certain infractions such as copyright, piracy, and otherwise can lead to a lot of sensitivity between businesses, people, and society in general, especially in instances where lower levels of people, lower classes, do not have access to new or latest technologies. Maybe they have to resort to piracy, maybe they have to resort to copyright. And if they're being punished for doing so, even though that code, that product is going to be obsolete the next day, then what's the justification? What are we looking at? Are we looking at the economic benefits, or are we looking at the benefits of society as well? And when you also have to consider the tyranny of the majority. If you do try to benefit society by making it easier, making it less punishable to copyright or pirate products, then in essence you're making the weight or value of those products created by innovators much less. And as we alluded to earlier in the section, that's going to hinder innovation itself. So it's a reciprocal effect. When we consider technology and innovation of intellectual property protections in the future, we have to ask how the intellectual property rights have evolved and have expanded up to this date, and where they're going to eventually end up. And when we outweigh the benefits of having IP rights in our society, today and in the future, some examples of costs could include having the implementation of such new innovations hindered by legalistic restrictions, both domestic and across borders, hindrances. And when we consider that, where does licensing and IP restrictions come to play when we're talking about more than one country, more than one superpower? When we consider China and the United States, for example, and there's an industry leader called Huawei. They deal with telecommunication technologies, and they were thought to have performed intellectual property espionage or other corporate espionage, where they were taking products or taking ideas or taking software from other companies and incorporating it into their own. And they were supposedly backed by the government, the Chinese government, the communist government. And communism, being the very opposite of capitalism, doesn't really sit well with companies located in the United States or countries such as the United States. And the United States ends up backing up companies with claims saying that, hey, Hawaii is taking our products. Where does IP, intellectual property rights, come to play then? Overall, intellectual property protection trying to predict where intellectual property protection, where its course is going to lead us, whether it's going to benefit society in the end or whether it's going to hinder innovation in the end, it's almost impossible to determine. If you look back in the beginning of intellectual property protection's inception in the medieval ages, yes, interest groups were a major part of that and actually did hinder innovation. But when it comes to multiple levels of industry, such as agriculture, technology, etc., etc., it's very difficult to determine if intellectual property protection is a hindrance or not. If you look at some of the links, some of the references that I made in my paper, such as IP watchdogs, it is noted due to statistical evidence that intellectual property protection overall does benefit society. And with those numbers as is, it looks like it will continue to do so. Since this presentation gets penalized for every minute over 8 minutes, I'm going to have to cut it short. But in the end, intellectual property protection when it comes to software is beneficial to society and will continue to be so unless more innovations such as more changes in innovations such as customizations, implementations, those become more common. But to this point, now copyright, just copying and pasting seems more common than actually customization. And since that copying and pasting implementation isn't on a commercial level, it's more on a private level, personal level amongst coders or amongst programmers, it doesn't seem to be getting much heat where it's actually a hindrance to innovation. And actually, many programmers, such as myself, have been using code that's been posted online, might be copyrighted, and it's continued to be copyrighted due to several practices that programmers use, such as comments in their code that can be viewed back end, implementations that could be referenced, and sources that can be cited. And if programmers continue to do so, to continue to point to the innovators, then the innovators will keep on innovating, and the customizers will keep on innovating as well. Thank you for my time, and that is it. That is my take on intellectual property protection and its impact on software development and distribution.